Hi, welcome to episode 36 of Startups Rights. Today, my guest is Jordan Abdi, Dr. Jordan Abdi, actually. He's the co-founder and CEO of U-Ploid Biotechnologies. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you for having me, Javed.
Really, first of all, thank you so much for making time for this. And I'm really excited for this episode. Fertility and reproductive health is a very interesting area, and there are a lot of developments in the space. And one of them is obviously your company, and your background itself is very impressive. But I don't want to talk too much about it myself. I want to give you the stage to talk about yourself in your own words. You have a very impressive background spanning, medicine, science, tech, policy. So tell us about yourself, Jordan.
Sure. So my name is Jordan Abdi. I think my story really begins at medical school. I think I chose medicine very much because I was very excited about kind of the big frontiers in human understanding. And the human body is one that we just do not understand very well. I think medicine's come a very long way, but compared to a lot of domains, I think human health, human biology is just not there. It's not what you see in other spaces. And there are areas that are really far behind. Think rare diseases, think like psychiatry, think the brain in general. But an area that I was quite surprised to learn, or eventually learn, is quite far behind, is reproductive health. And reproductive health remains remarkably behind other areas of healthcare. We have not seen major innovation for decades, and as a consequence, patients who are trying to have kids and what have you really struggle, particularly at the age of 35. And that's becoming increasingly a challenge, or increasingly a mainstream challenge, as more and more people decide to have children later in life. And I think we're long overdue this sort of innovation. But so I've now just veered into talking about the company, a bit about what we're doing. But really, as a personal motivation, really that's what brought me to medicine and eventually brought me to U-Ploid. And I've done a few things along the way that shaped me as a person and shaped how I think about the world. And really excited where I am now, trying to make a difference in people's lives and improve access to better reproductive care.
Jordan, you stepping away from medicine and pursuing other kind of avenues, was it a challenging decision, and what made you take that step?
Yes, the truth is it wasn't really a singular decision. I think it was a series of very small decisions. At medical school, I happened to find myself quite consistently doing things adjacent to medicine. The very sort of first core curriculum thing I did at medical school was a small organization called the London Forum for Science and Politics. It's a bit of a mouthful. We weren't marketeers. But the basic premise was, this is back in 2012, so think Professor David Nutt had just been fired, the chief scientific advisor to the UK government. And he, of course, was an imperial professor, but also a world-leading expert in psychoactive drugs. And the reason he was fired was because he published a paper talking about the impact of certain drugs and its relative risk compared to things like horse riding, which did not gel with the government's social policy at the time. And to think that you might fire your chief scientific advisor on the grounds of a Lancet publication, it ignited something in me and some friends that we decided we want to make a bit of a difference. So we set up this organization, LFSP, really with the intention to better provide parliamentarians with access to kind of cutting edge science. So they're better informed in their policy making. And there are lots of things, there were certainly more things wrong before, but frankly still the case, how few scientists are involved in policy making. And it's kind of an information gap between the two that's often filled with hype, and it's filled with kind of sci-fi that kind of acts as surrogate for real data. And a bunch of trials and tribulations. I really enjoyed that. Quite a successful venture. I tried again with something else. It was a very big failure, called Pocket Nurse, trying to improve medical education, disaster. And I kept coming back to the fact that I was really enjoying building things. And it wasn't so much building things in healthcare or building things in policy or building things with technology. Actually, it was the art of building things. And what I had learned in the journey was that I kind of was okay at it. I really enjoyed it, but I kind of wanted to get a lot better at it, to build something really exciting and to make a real impact. And so I think along that journey, I came to realize two things. A career is not going to really enable me necessarily to build things in their own right, although saying that there are lots of clinical entrepreneurs who do. The second thing was that actually the main motivation for departure was a program out of China called the Schwarzman Scholars program. I had the privilege of going to China before, so as part of my work with LFSP, I was able to join the UK delegation to the G20 summit way back in 2016, which happened that year to be hosted in Beijing, China. And they could have held it in Antarctica and I would have been excited to go. I think having left the conference and on the other side of having gone, the situation was reversed. I had lost all enthusiasm for international relations. It was a bit of a performative conference. I think everything had been decided up front. Most people's participation was entirely performative, but actually what I saw in China was kind of mind-blowing. I mean, you always read about how impressive China is and all the things that are happening there, but technologically, the attitude, the motivation, the ambition for the future was like really nothing I'd ever seen before. And I left that in 2016, really with two things in my mind. The first was China is really important and it's going to become more important. And two, like I like building things, but not necessarily in policy. And so, fast forward, graduated, was practicing in a London trust in acute medicine. And I was kind of thinking to myself, what's next? If I like China and I like building things, I want to improve my skill set, what is the next step for me? And I came across, by pure chance, this program in China called the Schwarzman Scholar program that kind of ticked all the boxes for me. And applied, I was very successful in the application, and so was fortunate to go and join that journey. And really what it enabled me to do was to see a bit more of China, take a more structured view. One of the programs I was taking were entrepreneurship, business, finance management, with the goal of eventually launching my own venture. That was really my journey out of medicine. It wasn't so much a single decision, but a series of smaller decisions, I think, along the way that landed me in a place where I felt that it was right for me to step into something new.
Gotcha. Schwarzman Scholarship, I actually applied to Schwarzman Scholarship, I think it was 2023. I became a finalist. I was actually in New York and, had the chance to actually, see and talk to Steven Schwarzman from a very close distance, which was very surreal. I'm a bit salty I didn't manage to become the Schwarzman Scholar, but it's a very interesting program. There are a lot of people who come from very different, diverse backgrounds. Did you feel like you managed to get what you wanted out of it in terms of like what you wanted to do with healthcare, etc.?
Yes and no. I mean, I think so I was there during COVID, right? So I was there 2019, 2020, which is an interesting time to be in China. I think when I went there, I was very much of the view that I wanted to stay there, at least for the medium term. Chinese biotech in particular is extremely exciting right now. It certainly was back then. It certainly will be in the future. It's an emerging market, particularly in biotech and healthcare, and the sheer scale in which you can do things in China is like nothing you can do anywhere else. So in many regards, I think, I very much view my chapter with China unfinished, although I suspect I won't ever finish that chapter. But on the other side, I definitely got to pursue the other things that I wanted to do there. I wanted to become a lot more exposed to kind of different entrepreneurs and different business practices and think about how managements are done in different parts of the world and how you think about global business and what role global relations play in building a global business. But yeah, COVID came. It was in Beijing, January 2020. It's Chinese New Year at the time, so Beijing really starts to thin out at that time because everyone goes home to their families for celebration. And Wuhan was in lockdown. There were rumors that Beijing was about to go into lockdown. So I was like there's really no point me being here. So I left what I thought was going to be a 2-week trip back to Europe. That has been, what is it now? 5 years. I'm still here.
No, that's very fair. Yeah, the COVID definitely distorted a lot of university college experiences, specifically because I also significant period of my college experience was also under COVID. What you said about China is very much right. China's biotech scene is growing fast. A lot is happening. It's also, you see a lot of American firms also sometimes turn to Chinese biotechs because it's cheaper to develop too. And there are a lot of other things too. As somebody who's really knowledgeable and experienced in that space, in that geography, what China is doing right and what can we learn from them in that space, in healthcare and biotech?
Yeah, I think it's far better for me to tell China what they can do better. I think they really have built an ecosystem that's working across the country. I think they have kind of 3 embedded advantages, and one, just the sheer scale of the population, the sheer scale of the hospitals. I mean, you go to some of these cancer centers, in second-tier Chinese cities, they've got a throughput of 1 million patients a year. I mean, how many hospitals can you point to in the West that kind of throughput? When you just think of the number of trials you could theoretically run in parallel with that kind of scale. So you've got a very, very large population with really, really kind of big centralized hospital systems that kind of lean or lend well to clinical research. You then have extremely low costs for your basic research. I think the areas where the gap exists or remains between China and the West sit around kind of qualities and control. That's where you see a lot of the deals break down when either they're transferring or there are licensing deals, or Chinese biotech are looking to replicate kind of early preclinical work elsewhere. That definitely is an area where Chinese biotech is lacking, but it won't be lacking for very long. I think certainly if you look at the Chinese broader economy, one of the things they've done exceptionally well over the last 3-4 decades is manufacturing controls and quality. And so that will bleed into biotech. It's a bit different for developing drugs and treatments, but they will get there. And I think, when we think about what that means for Western biotech and Western pharma, you are seeing this explosion, particularly since COVID, of, as you mentioned, these licensing deals, where big pharma will go in. There's certain platforms that China are just leading on, ADCs. By far, the ADC platforms, China is by far well ahead. And it's just becoming cheaper now to go to China, license out a few technologies, because the Chinese biotechs do not have the resources to take these sorts of things globally. And similarly, the level of exposure that Western companies can afford in China is also compromised by, I think, what is happening geopolitically. And so you've got this kind of interesting dynamic emerging in the space where a lot of these kind of bigger life science companies are kind of extracting technologies from China in a kind of a win-win partnership way, where I think eventually we'll start to see more companies kind of take their own agency, Chinese companies, and go global on their own. There are already a few. I mean, Beijing being maybe one of the bigger ones, but more will come.
What are kind of the major lessons you think we can learn from them and try to incorporate what we see in Europe or in the US?
Yeah, I mean, China has something, I think maybe you see a bit of this in the US as well, but like this extreme can-do attitude. I think part of it is it's baked into the social fabric. I mean, if you think about people our age, your parents, let's say, people our age typically work in tech. The big cities, they'll work in tech or a white-collar job or whatever it might be. They're university educated. You look at their parents' generation, their parents would have worked on factory floors. Their grandparents would have worked on farms. And so when you go back every year for Chinese New Year celebrations or any kind of family gathering, and you have that before your eyes, visible generational transformation of your fortunes, like you just have an inbuilt expectation that the next generation is going to look better, and anything is possible. So I think what you see in the Chinese national psyche is this just hardwired belief that things are going to get better, the future is really bright, China's on the ascendant. It's not the message I think you generally read about China outside of China. I think there's a lot more focus on their demographics, which is a real challenge, and all the rest of it. But when you're there, you can really feel that optimism. There's something that bleeds into a bit of nationalism and the belief that something intrinsic about China or Chinese people that I don't know is actually contributing to the overall piece and may lead to some broader ways in which how Chinese increasingly interact with the rest of the world. And certainly this kind of inbuilt optimism you see, and certainly that's kind of led to this very, very exciting entrepreneurial ecosystem, which has been successful in many domains, right? All sorts of technological domains, you're seeing big Chinese players, but certainly in biotech, they are emerging from stealth increasingly.
Got it. So it's very much like a very pragmatic and deterministic approach to optimism. It's really cool. One thing I just want to briefly ask before we move on to other questions. You said one thing they're kind of a bit lacking was the quality control. And a question I want to ask is, do you think you can have both the speed and the quality at the same time, or do you think it would be more like having your cake and eating it too?
I think this is a solvable problem. I think it's solvable. I mean, if you look at how China has come to dominate pretty much the entire global manufacturing supply chain, they started with low quality goods generally. Very small, cheap to produce, low tolerance levels on manufacturing quality and controls. Now you're seeing high-end semiconductor chips, PV solar cells, all these sort of advanced machines that are being exported from China have required them to make several leaps in terms of quality controls. The same leaps will happen in biotech. I don't think there's anything intrinsically special in processes when it comes to therapeutics that will necessarily hold them behind. But certainly where we are in 2025, that is the big gap I think we see between China and the bigger and more established ecosystems in Europe and the United States.
Gotcha. So we're gonna start talking about your company, U-Ploid Biotechnologies. But before that, I want to ask what motivated you to pursue this kind of company in the fertility space. And you mentioned one thing, is that fertility hasn't really kept up with all the advances, like technological, scientific advances, which is very interesting to me, because everybody wants to have a kid eventually. Most people want to have a kid eventually, and especially now that women, because of their professional pursuits or academic pursuits and etc., they delay the pregnancies, they delay having kids. Seems like there's more need to actually have technology in this space. So what do you think kind of like derailed that progress in this space, and what motivated you personally to pursue your company in this space?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there are probably several answers. I mean, my view on why it's so far behind and under invested in, it's just the hard economics of having children. 20 years ago, or frankly, even today to an extent, like having kids, the act of having kids is free for the most part. Right? People will have kids, and give it 20, 30 years ago, the vast majority of people have kids for free. The edge cases, maybe 40 years ago, edge cases where people might require help, either because of a pre-existing medical condition or, developed infertility or subfertility, those contributed now to a difficulty having children. So I think the hard economics of like what does the market size look like to address the problem has sat in the small and not life-threatening bucket. And you can manifest that over several decades, you get the kind of results we've had today, which is a shame, because today we really are quite far behind. It's a shame also, I think, because we really did make a huge leap in assistive reproduction 50 years ago with the advent of IVF. And so like the act of doing really, really, really innovative things in this space is not new. And, here in the UK, the Bourne Hall Clinic up in Cambridge, the very first IVF, it's a testament to the fact that actually there's a lot of innovation that can happen. The whole idea of conception outside of the body happening such a long time ago would lead you to believe, certainly at the time, that who knows what might come next in terms of this field. But in honesty, very little has. I think the last major innovation in the field was in 1992, the advent of the ICSI needle. Pretty exciting. You can inject sperm directly into the egg cell, and you can resolve a male factor infertility. Kind of, with that's 30 years ago. We've not really seen anything since. And I think that what's changed, and the reason why you're seeing now so many more companies in this field, is this is no longer a niche problem. It's no longer a niche problem because increasingly people having children later in life contributing to the challenge. I think you've got broader demographic challenges, so governments are paying attention to the domestic birth rates. That has long-term economic implications for how do they finance their pensions, how do they finance the state, how do they think about immigration. There's so many bigger political and economic considerations that policymakers are now opining on. And then, of course, you have increasing willingness to pay for this sort of treatment. Even in the UK, not just the UK, actually, you're seeing this across many socialized healthcare systems. But even in the UK, where IVF is free at the point of use, up to 3 cycles for women up to the age of 42, the vast majority of IVF is paid out of pocket in private centres. Reason being, this is a time-sensitive procedure that cannot sit on waiting lists, and whilst it's not life-threatening per se, it's extremely important to people, their quality of life, their goals, and their ambitions. And so I think the problem has finally kind of breached the surface. There's a long way to go, but I think the tension is now zooming in on actually how big is the problem. The economics now make sense. So what are the sort of innovations that are coming down the pipeline that we should be really investing in and moving forward? And I think there are many, and there are many bottlenecks in the field. And that's something that we at U-Ploid are very excited about. We certainly have our core program, but at the end of the day, there's so much to resolve in this space, and there's so much to do.
Well, now that you mentioned U-Ploid, let's talk about U-Ploid. What's the mission and vision you have with U-Ploid Biotechnologies?
Well, yeah, I mean, perhaps it won't be surprising after what I've just said to learn that our real mission is to completely revolutionize the access to reproductive health. I think fundamentally today, if you are in your late 30s, early 40s, struggling to get pregnant, you try IVF, you're unsuccessful, it's kind of a question mark. So nothing we can do, shrug shoulders, let's talk about other options. That's unacceptable. And very much at U-Ploid, our ambition is to tackle each and every single bottleneck in a patient's reproductive journey to ensure that if you want to have children and you've set up your life to enable you to have children, that we can facilitate that. And there are several areas of problems in a patient's fertility journey that we can go after. As a company, obviously resource limited, we have to focus on, I think, where we think the lowest hanging fruit are and where the biggest opportunities are. But really, if we fast forward 10 years from now, across the spectrum of patients' reproductive life, U-Ploid will be playing a role, and that's certainly what we're working towards.
And one of the major focus areas, correct me if I'm wrong, is the egg quality, right?
Yes.
You guys are focusing on. And, when you read about fertility treatments, you look at, you see IVF, obviously is one of the most famous ones. There's some hormonal stimulations. There's, like the embryo freezing, there's egg freezing. There's new algorithms to track the sperms to choose the most optimal sperm for the IVF treatment, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of things happening. But the egg quality hasn't been really talked about a lot. And I guess I'm wondering why, and also why did you guys decide to focus on egg quality too?
Really, a staged question. A number of things to say there. Why has no one focused on egg quality so far? I think the problem is partly market, kind of alluded to earlier. Solving anything in this space just hasn't had the correct market conditions to justify real risk taking. I think it has really for the last 15 years, but we just haven't seen many players take that risk. And if you look at most of the innovation that's coming today, and that's not to take anything away from the innovation that's happening today, but most of it sits in the can we diagnose better bucket. And that's very important for things like can we better identify low quality embryos to ensure that the best chance of pregnancy is given to the patient, rather than can we fix those embryos. Now, think about the sperm diagnostics companies. Can we better identify male factor infertility, rather can we fix male factor infertility? And so I think it's moving in the right direction. I think we're getting better resolution of the problem, which will inevitably help companies develop solutions to those challenges. But we're still very much in the let's characterize, let's better diagnose, let's give more information to patients and clinicians. I think if we break down reproductive biology, there's really only three components. I mean, it's not strictly true, there are other factors, but broadly speaking, there are three components. You've got the egg, you've got the sperm, and you've got the womb. You need all three of those in concert to be healthy, to have a viable pregnancy, and then to have a viable delivery. And when we think about what's actually happening with IVF or assisted reproduction more broadly, we're really just working with the status quo. How well is your eggs? Let's work with what you have. If you can freeze them when you're young, excellent. But if not, we'll work with what you have. And if your eggs are too low quality or the woman is too old, let's talk about egg donors. Let's talk about surrogacy. Let's talk about adoption. Right? It's a case of let's deal with the world as it is, and let's not necessarily try to intervene. Similar with sperm. I think with sperm, there are now better solutions. I mentioned egg C back in 92. If the sperm doesn't work, and this is only one of the issues with sperm, but it is the main one, fertility, we can inject the sperm into the egg. And with womb, again, it's a bit of a mystery. Some people have really great implantation rates. Some people just really don't. Are there ways in which we can resolve that? Some interesting companies emerging that are looking at improving implantation rates and how do we keep the womb healthy and viable to support pregnancy. But broadly speaking, those are the domains. And if we think about where does the biggest opportunity lie, in our view, certainly to make a big difference in patients' parenthood journeys, it's the egg. It's the egg because that's the variable that changes most dramatically in a reproductive journey. And particularly after the age of 35, you start to see a pretty precipitous fall in the quality of oocytes, leading to what that manifests as a lower and lower likelihood of a viable pregnancy with each month, either through natural conception or each cycle as it comes to IVF. And our view is if we can tackle that challenge, if we can ensure that every month or every cycle we're maximizing the chances of that egg being viable, which, by the way, you're talking about 40 years old, 80 to 90% of eggs are not viable. That means 8 out of 9 months, 9 out of 10 months, 8 out of 10 months, eggs that are being produced just are not viable. And so it's like rolling the die. You get to 42, it's something way below 5% are viable. And that's true of IVF as well. And so you've got this situation where if you want to make a really big difference, if you want to actually improve the likelihood of an IVF cycle being successful or a natural conception being successful, it comes down really to the egg quality, particularly in that age group, which is where parents increasingly find themselves trying to start a family. And so that's kind of how we structured the thinking around going after the oocyte. But really, as I say, the ambition is broader. There are sperm issues to resolve for, endometrium issues to resolve for, broad human health issues to resolve for, to end up in a world where people can accessibly access effectively treatments to improve their own chances of building a family.
Gotcha. This is really interesting, really fascinating. I guess just one thing I want to clarify in case somebody's wondering, what do you mean by egg quality, and reduced egg quality? How would you kind of like define that in a few sentences?
Basically, to define it is, can the egg support a viable embryo? Is the egg capable of, when fertilized, developing into a viable embryo? And the answer is it either can or it can't. In your peak reproductive years, so let's say early 20s, mid 20s, you'd expect somewhere around 80% of eggs to be viable, capable of this process. By the time you sort of look at mid 30s, you probably drop below half. By 40, say it's about 80% are not viable, and by 42, it's less than viable. And so that's what we're talking about. And there are a few biological components that drive that egg quality. Actually, can the egg do its basic metabolic functions? And so there's a whole world of research around mitochondrial disorders and how we improve that. There's whole questions about genomics, right? So can the maternal egg pass on the genes to the embryo correctly? And there's a whole body of research that kind of looks at that. And then there are areas around the actual viability of the egg for a whole bunch of other reasons. And the big one, by far the biggest one, is the genomic contribution. Can the egg correctly pass on its genes to the embryo? And that's really the function that's lost with age. And that's really the piece to fix or the piece to resolve for if we're really to unlock better outcomes for women over the age of 35.
Interesting. That's really interesting. But Jordan, you mentioned that eventually your goal is to address a lot of bottlenecks, not just one aspect of the process. And let's just give you a hypothetical. Let's say it's 28. I'm a 39-year-old woman that walks into IVF clinic. How would U-Ploid Biotechnologies would be integrated kind of seamlessly in the patient experience, but also the clinical workflows?
So did you say 2028?
2029, 2028.
Sure, fine. So effectively in the near term future. Well, if I don't want to, and this is really important, I really don't want to over-egg the amount of research and development that has to happen before we really start to see material improvements in clinical research. It is critically important. So my background, certainly post-China, I've been working mostly in rare disease research. And what's super important when you're bringing new technologies to the market, particularly where there are very few that exist already. So rare diseases, many of the therapeutics coming to market are orphan. No existing technologies to support these patients. It's really important that you do two things. One, you bring the patient along on the journey. And so we do a lot of work with patients to help us understand where they are, us understand where the problems lie. How do we conduct research in the right way, in the way that best supports their needs, so that when we are on the market, we're there? That's critically important. You try and bring new technology to the market that don't really have much that target that issue, and you do so without involving the patient, the outcomes are really bad. The second thing is to not over-egg or in any way over-promise where you actually are. We are very excited by what we're developing. We are very excited by the results we have in the lab, and we are very excited about the prospects it may have for human health in the future. But we need to actually bear out the results in data. We need to begin our clinical trials, and we need to get to a place actually where when we do launch on the market, there is a body of research that supports its safety, its efficacy, its uses, so that clinicians and patients can have the confidence to pursue these treatments with kind of all the enthusiasm that we hope to bring. At 2028, 2029, I really don't want to paint you a picture of a world that's necessarily so dramatically different from today. I think if we go a little further ahead, we get maybe 2050, and think about, okay, what does the reproductive landscape look like then? Actually, I imagine it's entirely different. I even wonder if we have an IVF industry as we do today at all. I think a lot of the problems that we resolve with IVF are, okay, well, we can't resolve these issues inside the body, so let's bring everything outside, do it all in the lab, and then take everything back in. I think actually you look at the long tail of where does the technology go. I suspect we'll get very good at resolving egg quality issues, sperm quality issues inside the body, and actually move back to a world where patients who are struggling with conception can still naturally conceive, albeit with support with newer technologies and treatments. So I think that's where we're going. That's certainly the world that we at U-Ploid want to build, because the journey, I mean, anyone who's gone through IVF will know it's painful, it's emotionally distressing to go through cycles of unknown outcomes. Physically, it's a pretty grueling process, certainly for the woman. The hormone cycle that is involved beforehand is horrendous, with daily injections. I mean, I think when you zoom out, you think about where we are now, there's a much better world we can build for people who are going through challenges with their reproductive health. And certainly, when we think about what we're doing at U-Ploid, we want to paint a picture where actually it's as pain-free, as easy, as accessible as possible, much like how you expect for pretty much the rest of your healthcare.
Sort of, just to clarify for myself, essentially the tech and the science you guys bringing to the market will not have to, will seamlessly integrate into clinical workflows. Because I know the doctors and even the patients, they tend to resist to change, especially when it's like a very significant change and it applies to their health. But what you guys trying to bring to the market, it will just be integrated very seamlessly, right?
Exactly. We work very closely. We have a number of clinical partners around the world that we're working on to effectively get to a place where this is seamless. Seamless for the patient, seamless for the clinicians, seamless for the clinics, to the extent where actually it's almost like a toggle switch. Either want the treatment or you don't. If you want the treatment, it's kind of all plugged in and ready to go. And that's certainly critically important. And as you say, you're bringing a new technology into a space where not much news has arrived before, particularly when it pertains to outcomes. You've got to really pay attention to implementation.
Gotcha. And I guess let's talk about a bit more macro stuff. The biotech space in general, it hasn't been doing well lately. I mean, with the current administration in the US cutting funding to research, I mean, even the private markets haven't been doing amazingly. I think if you take GLPs out of the equation, you don't really, you don't see a lot of significant success stories. What are the major issues, challenges you're seeing currently in the biotech space?
I don't know, I'm going to push back and say maybe it's a bit pessimistic. I actually don't think the biotech market is as bad as I think it's being given a kind of a rap for. I think there are lots of modalities that people are now challenging. I think the whole platform play of like the early 2020s, where that was where the future of all biotech was going to go. I think a lot of that buzz has died down, and in doing so, there are a couple of high-profile companies that are struggling. I think it's also worth just acknowledging, of course, that biotech and life sciences is a cyclical industry. The fortunes of the sector move inversely to interest rates. I think we're in a world now where interest rates are coming down. Maybe they won't come down as quickly as maybe thought 6 months ago, but they are coming down. And I think we can expect, here on out, better and improved capital inflows to the sector. But actually, I think when you look from an innovation perspective, you think about what's actually happening on the biotech. There are so many interesting technologies coming to market. I mean, think about CRISPR, think what's happening with gene editing technologies, think what's happening with new, immunomodulating technologies. And there's so many areas now in the field that we are moving at leaps and bounds, and where outcomes in early research is showing really dramatic improvement. I think it can be easy to get really bogged down or focused on capital markets, because that's very much the tip of the iceberg that's available to the public in terms of what's happening. I think we don't pay enough attention to the publications. We certainly don't have access to readouts of trials, certainly nothing preclinical, and trials not until the readout, that we're kind of in a lag phase. And I think if we were having this conversation in 12 months, I think that the narrative would have shifted the other way. It may be even too optimistic around where we are. But I think there's just so much happening under the surface. Look, we're based in Oxford. We are inculcated into an environment where there's just so many biotech companies, and the vibes, the atmosphere is incredibly positive. People are constantly raising rounds. They're increasingly not disclosing those rounds, I think, as they want to build almost in stealth for as long as possible. And in doing so, I think a lot of the private capital, certainly at the early end of the market, isn't necessarily as visible as some of the bigger rounds you might see later on. I think licensing deals in general have slowed down in part because we're seeing it's the kind of macro stuff mentioned earlier, but I think on the other side, we're seeing a lot of these big pharma reevaluate their own internal portfolio and their own internal pipeline plans, and in doing so are trying to kind of actually wait out and see what makes sense in 2 or 3 years around, do they want to double down on some of these particular oncology platforms that are coming to play, or actually are there new indications that it's kind of going to be where the markets are moving. So I think there's a little bit of hesitancy, I think, from big pharma to necessarily bite in. But even at JPM this year, we saw a couple of big deals, the Scorpion deal. The deals are happening. I just think where we are in the macro sense, it's just we're kind of not seeing below the surface, and kind of getting a bit too narrative attached to the big stories, which admittedly there are fewer than we saw maybe a couple of years ago.
Do you feel like late stage assets are getting more attention compared to like early stage science?
Certainly, and I think that's always going to be the case, right? I mean, when you think about drugs going through pipeline, the attrition rates proportionate. And so things that are closer to the market are going to get a lot more attention. The power of those studies are significantly greater, and they also have a lot more investment. So certainly that's what we'll see. We mentioned China earlier. I think we're seeing a similar type of portfolio assessment by big pharma around actually, do you want to spend a significantly higher amount of money licensing in technologies from an American or a European company, or is there a Chinese firm, 10% of the cost, where you can license in with just as good outcomes? And I think that's actually probably part of the story, certainly because of the volume of stuff coming out of China at the moment. Whether that price differential will remain, TBD. But certainly, early stage assets are not going to have that kind of exposure anyway. And so, and also it's worth saying that at early stage, the amount of data that you want to publish or can publish is also limited by the sorts of studies you can conduct.
Do you think there's something fundamentally wrong with the way biotech companies are being built? I mean, they're still very much done in their traditional way, research coming out of academic labs, then, they're sourced early, they turn into companies, and even the VCs that work in the space usually have PhDs and MDs at least. Some like where tech, especially, there's some changes now with tech, bio, and AI, and etc. But do you think there's just a way, whether it's about incentives, whether it's about the process itself, and etc. Do you think there's something wrong and fundamentally wrong with the way biotech companies are built? And do you think you would want some other changes to happen in space?
I think there's something fundamentally wrong, more so in Europe than maybe you see in the US, but with academic spinouts. There are so many stories now, particularly in biotech, where you have relatively naive but incredibly brilliant scientists want to take their research out of the lab, and they're overwhelmed by rather greedy TTOs, maybe an enthusiastic professor who actually is of the view that all of the value in building a company resides in the academic IP, which is actually fundamentally opposite. All of the value a company will generate, unless the IP is critical to what they're building, then of course there is value in the IP. But the vast majority of the value that a company builds is everything that happens after the spin-out. Right after the company's formed, after it's actually now got to go and demonstrate everything and build all of the relationships necessary to bring a technology to market. And I think a lot of companies, and I certainly know some, have just had to die in the womb almost because the terms of the spin out just make them uninvestable. There may be university TTOs that are very excited about the terms they got, the royalties or the equity share, whatever it might be, but actually what do they have to show for it? Very little. I think there's much we can learn from the Americans on this regard. We should have significantly more liberal attitudes towards spin-outs, a far greater tolerance of failure, where actually we don't need big slicers or a lot of domineering views of or dominance on how the companies are run after they've left. Actually, if they fail, that's okay. I mean, I always think about the Moderna story, right? Coming out of what a phenomenal example. I think what I kind of wish would have happened on the back of that was like a surge of enthusiasm across Europe, where IP is phenomenal towards like let's build the next Moderna. Let's see what's possible if we really kind of loosen the strings and encourage entrepreneurs to go and build. I think that's changing. I think it's changing in part because I think the message is being received. There are great organizations like Will Be, have made it their mission to advocate for scientists and support their spin-outs. I think we're seeing actually TTOs get the message. I certainly friends I know who are spinning out seem to have a much better time than maybe was the case 5 years ago. But I also think in this era of AI, I really don't want to spend much time on AI, but I think in the era of AI and the cost of drug discovery really beginning its descent now, actually I suspect we will see an increasing number of biotechs emerge almost entirely independent of academic research, in that actually a lot of this heavy lifting can be done independently, and certainly outside of the big institutions with the big capital budgets. So we may actually see a new wave or a new generation of technologies come to market that are perhaps less dependent on that entire pathway altogether. We're not close to that at all, but I think certainly if we fast forward 10 years from now, I suspect we'll see a lot more de novo biotech companies emerge, made up of talent that maybe was at leading institutions, but very much building IP from the ground up.
Yeah, Europe is definitely not lacking talent. Yeah, we didn't talk much about AI stuff, but I want to ask you because you already mentioned, obviously AI, the drug discovery and AI, they're just kind of go hand in hand now. You see a bunch of companies in the space. One of them, I guess, in Silicon that comes to mind, and some of them focus on developing novel kind of drugs using AI, designing, the interactions, etc. Or some of them are focused on optimizing kind of clinical trials, etc. What part of it is the most exciting to you personally?
Ooh, good question. I mean, I won't comment too much on the drug discovery piece. I think there's a lot of hype there at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Demis has made his comment about the end of disease. I really don't think that we're really on that track. I think the area that I'm most excited about, though, is on the clinical trial side. Clinical trials, by their design and nature, haven't materially changed for decades at all. It probably go back even further, in part because the data requirements of a clinical trial have to be held at the highest standard. And so there are just really rigid limitations around how you conduct those studies and therefore how you run them. That's changing. It's changing, I think, with novel synthetic databases, real-world databases. I think it's changing when it comes to how regulators think about collecting data and running those studies. I think, fast forward 10 years from now, we will see a lot more nimble, maybe not at the pivotal phase 3, but certainly think post-market, certainly think your phase 1s, a lot more, or even maybe phase 2A, nimbler trial designs that maybe are looking at real-world control arms, actually, because we already know what it's like to have heart disease. There are tens of millions of people who tick our inclusion-exclusion criteria for a study, and actually, instead of having them come into the study and take a placebo and do the whole thing in parallel to the other, why don't we just use the millions of patients who've already done that and sat on a placebo with the exact same set of criteria? And it's not quite that simple, but actually, I think we are seeing greater enthusiasm from regulators to look at this sort of thing. I mean, the company called Unlearn AI, building a very interesting technology in this space, actually to improve how we think about trial design. And I think that's going to lead to a reduction of cost for running these studies, which actually lowers the barrier for technologies to come to market. It actually also, I think, will end up reducing dependence of these smaller biotechs on looking for that licensing deal, on looking for that exit quite early, because they may be able to take it all the way to market on their own, if the costs and if the study designs support that kind of study. And that's not going to suit every study design. Think about 5-year survival rates in cancer. There's not much you can do to get around that, and those will be very expensive always. But I think about rare disease in particular, actually there's so much scope to reduce the cost of those trials and to get new treatments to patients faster. So yeah, I don't know if that's the most exciting thing in the market, but I think in terms of most impactful, it's clinical trial.
One thing you mentioned about European kind of, the academic kind of spinouts and etc. I mean, I agree that the TTO sometimes ask for 40% equity and etc. And also another thing I noticed myself, I mean, I was talking to this one academic founder, and she was telling me how she feels the need to de-risk her science with grants and etc. before she can ask for VC investment, which, as we talked about, IP is very important, but the execution speed and execution itself is way more important than the IP. That's where you lose very often, right? So do you think something needs to be done about this?
Improving execution of startups.
About the de-risking the science before you can, with grants and etc., before you can even go. Because I feel like in US you are more likely to just raise a lot of early stage funding before the grant applications take a while, approvals and the money coming in. So yeah.
It's a tough one. It's tough one, I think, for two reasons. I think one, grants will fund things that VC won't. So unless you're in a market or developing technology with a really obvious application, even if you're very far away, but the application is obvious, the impact is obvious, you probably can go straight to VC. It will take a long time. You'll have to spend a lot of time crying over rejections, but you'll raise the money. I think if you're in an area where the technology is really interesting, but where the application is not yet clear, you think about the sorts of grants that would have had to go in to support things like CRISPR, long before it was obvious or intuitive that it could go on to repair a series of really specific genetic disorders. That would have been difficult to do. Possible maybe, but difficult. And I think if you look at the long term of clinical research, the most interesting things that come to bear fruit in the last decade actually have their homes in really obscure research that happen to have led eventually to discoveries and insights that then led on to commercial applications. And so I would say, unless you have the story in your mind, at least, of how the technology makes a difference to the world and why anyone outside of the lab should care, unless you have that, grants are always going to be a better source of capital. And they have all of their downsides, all of the commensurate downsides that come with that. But it likely also means you're operating out of an academic lab with all the resources, all of the administrative support, which you cannot underestimate. Once you're out on your own in the cold, you've got to do all that yourself or hire those people and realize, what skills you need to do that effectively. And so I think it depends. I think there's always edge cases, plenty of people who go out and do really exciting things. I don't know if you follow the story of Colossal. Raised an enormous amount of money on something that as yet, I think certainly as far as the public is concerned, has very little by way of clear commercial application. I mean, I have a view as to where that company is eventually going to land, but where they are today, it's like, okay, this is really interesting science, but so what?
Mm.
How many direwalls do we need? So it can be done.
Yeah.
I think it just requires the patience with the capital market, a bit of luck, obviously, and obviously the right story.
Jordan, this has been a fascinating episode. We're coming towards the end of our episode. I'm gonna ask.
Pleasure's been mine.
But genuinely, I learned so much from you. You're really one of the smartest people I've talked to, and I'm being very honest.
That's not true.
So I guess one question I'm curious about, you're definitely very aware of the biotech space and healthcare space. If you weren't building U-Ploid, and if you weren't building in the reproductive health space, what other biotech health problems you would go after?
I think there's only two sectors left. There's only two sectors left where you have truly global scale impact with a single asset. The first is reproductive health for all the reasons I've spoken about. I think the second is antimicrobial resistance. It's a problem that is not so much a scientific challenge. I mean, there's definitely a scientific challenge. We need to find better modalities to resolve the problem. But the superbug crisis is growing, and it's going to have an exponential increase in impact on our lives as our barriers to defense against infectious disease fall. The real challenge is the commercial, the business model innovation required to enable companies to go through the enormous expense of developing a brand new antibiotic or antifungal or pathogen treatment so that the patient takes it for 10 days once every 3 years. I mean, the commercials don't make sense compared to let me build the latest, heart failure medication that the patient would take 3 times a day for the next 40 years. The case is there. It doesn't really matter how successful, it doesn't matter what you price it at. You know that the case is going to be there if you get to market. And we certainly, when we look at the problem set, there is just nothing else out there that I think will have as big an impact on the human population outside of maybe reproductive health. That is antimicrobial resistance. And I don't know the solution to that problem, but I think if I wasn't at U-Ploid, that would be, I think, the big problem I would be spending my time and my attention on.
Well, for people watching, here you go. There's an area, sector you can go after. I guess, finally, if you any parting thoughts regarding, the U-Ploid yourself, and also, I guess, for the listeners who want to work at the intersection of science, medicine, and entrepreneurship, who want to pursue a path you pursued yourself, what would you advise as well?
I don't know if this is particularly novel advice, but I think it's an illusion. Often it's certainly an illusion in my case that a path is mapped out or was obvious or there was some clear direction at all in my life. When I was at school, I wanted to be a particle physicist. I mean, up to the age of 16, I was set. I wanted to work at CERN. That's what I was going to do. Clearly, that didn't happen. I think what matters more than anything else is just if you find something interesting and exciting, don't worry about the commercials. Don't worry about how it makes sense for you. Just pursue it because you don't know where it leads. You open one door and there are 3 doors behind. And you'll end up 10 years later looking back on your journey, having chosen many of those doors at random and landed somewhere that's quite exciting and you'll be very happy with where you are, but without much to say other than you just kept opening doors and kept the curiosity. I think that's all that you can really do. And anything else is is a bit of luck and enjoy the journey on the way.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been Dr. Jordan Abdi, co-founder and CEO of U-Ploid Biotechnologies. Thanks again, Jordan, for a wonderful one.
Thank you, Javed. Thanks for having me.